Hi, my name is Miranda Rechtenwald. I'm the Curator of Local History at Washington University Libraries. And thank you for joining us today for a talk in honor of LGBTQ History Month. And I'm just gonna share my slides here with you all. Maybe, there we go. All right. So this is a talk in honor of LGBTQ History Month, which is October every year. This is about the third year that we've had a History Month program at the libraries, but this is our first virtual one, so welcome to everyone, including a number of folks who registered who aren't in St. Louis, so welcome to you all. And as you may or may not know, I certainly know someone on this call is aware, LGBT History Month was started in 1994 by Rodney Wilson, who is a St. Louisan himself. He was at the time a teacher in suburban St. Louis, and he started the month as a way of spotlighting LGBTQ history and picked October partly because it would be when school was in session, and also because that is when National Coming Out Day, October 11th, already fell. So it was a good dovetailing. And I'm really happy to welcome Rodney to join us today. I'm glad you could make it, Rodney. All right. So today, what I'm going to talk about a little bit is some of the LGBTQ plus collections that are at Washington University Archives, as well as some collections that are at other St. Louis institutions. There is a guide online, which you'll find at this website, and it lists links and gives a summary of all the available collections. And this is something I do update and continually add to. So I'm not going to be able to talk about all of these collections today, but if this is something that interests you to kind of see what else we have in the archives, this is a great place to go to get started and get a list of archival collections. We also have links to where you can find locally published LGBTQ newspapers and magazines that were published over the years. And those are found at Washington University, but also the Missouri Historical Society and the Missouri State Archives. All right. So today, what I'm going to do is give you a brief overview of some new materials that have come into the archive. First, I'm going to highlight for you some items from a brand new collection, which are the papers of Laura Ann Moore. Some of you on this call knew Laura Ann. Then I'm also going to move on and talk about some things we found in the archives in existing collections, and talk a little bit about the new things for the digital project mapping LGBTQ St. Louis. So just to start, Laura Ann Moore was an activist and very involved in the LGBTQ community in St. Louis. She was a very out and proud lesbian woman. She sadly passed away in 2015, and in 2018, in the spring of 2018, I worked with her longtime partner, Marlene, and Marlene at that time decided she was ready to donate the collection. Sadly, since then, last year, Marlene herself passed away, and Marlene was quite ill at the time. And so she was concerned about a place for Laura's papers, because really Marlene was all of Laura's family that she had left, although certainly many close friends. And so I worked with Marlene to pack up the collection and bring it to the archives. We have been working with organizing the collection since mid-2019, and I had hoped by spring 2020 that it would be completed and ready for researchers to use, but of course we're about a semester and a half behind because of everything being delayed. So my hope is to have it finished by the end of the year. As this picture is showing you, it's about 50 of these archival boxes just in terms of size. And I'm going to show you just some of the highlights. It's a very large collection. And I will say, I am fascinated to learn more about Laura's life. I never had a chance to meet her. I am very glad I had a chance to meet Marlene and hear about her from Marlene. I wish I had had an opportunity to meet Laura while she was alive. I can say with a great deal of certainty that of the things that concerned Laura, filing papers was not one of them. I don't think more than maybe a couple of handfuls of her papers were in actual file folders and in any kind of organization. Otherwise, they were just kind of piles of papers in boxes. But they did get saved, and so that's the important part. So just to kind of showcase a few of the things that I think are particularly noteworthy from the collection, although these are just some of the gems. There's many, many more. One of these is, you know, her entire collection is amazing, but one of the things Laura did early on in 1975, she became one of the first 2 women to take classes at Rankin Technical Institute, which up until that point had only admitted boys and men to their classes. And so she and another woman were interested in learning car repair. And Rankin Technical Institute was one of the few schools that offered car repair classes, and she signed up and insisted that they let her in. And so this is her registration letter. And then after she took classes, and she'd also taught herself learning from how-to books, after she had some more skills at car repair, she opened what she called the Women's Garage, car repair by and for women. It was a cooperative in that it offered people the opportunity to trade goods and services in addition to paying with traditional cash money. And Laura operated this for a number of years. I think it operated for 4 to 5 years. One of the things that really amazed me as I was going through this, because this was not something I was aware of until I found this flyer, is that in conjunction with Washington University, Laura offered from the Women's Garage a series of workshops in 1977 that were held on campus. And this was sponsored by the Washington University Women's Programming Board, Campus Programming, and the Student Union. And I was not aware that this had ever occurred. There was not another copy of this flyer in the university archives. That's sadly not too surprising because not a lot of that material got saved. The women's programming, especially early on, the women who worked on it, and they just kind of kept those things themselves. They were not of interest at the time to the university archives. Unfortunately, they certainly are now. Another aspect that's really fascinating about the collection of her papers is it really demonstrates how interlinked different organizations were in gay and lesbian activism, especially early on in the 1970s. So these documents here, so starting from the yellow paper that says Woman Power, that's dated 1974. So this is a note from someone named Pat who is writing, and in this letter, she references that she's telling Laura she will try to get in an advertisement about the Women's Garage into their newsletter. And she also mentions that the NOW answering service, the National Organization of Women, which was fairly active in St. Louis, that they were giving out the alliance number frequently. That's the last line of that little yellow note. And that's the Lesbian Alliance, which is another group that Laura helped found. And so within this one little note is, you know, really a lot of information talking about how, you know, how the National Organization of Women was giving out information about the Lesbian Alliance, and also the Intertwined with the Women's Garage. The document in the middle is a press release that Laura wrote up that she sent out to some radio stations. The ones jotted on there looks like the student radio stations at St. Louis University and Wash U, and also some small independent stations. And this is listening about the Gay Liberation Front organization. And it's giving some details about where they're meeting. And then it also mentions that there's this mechanics co-op. And I don't know much about this mechanics co-op, but I imagine it is obviously connected to the Women's Garage. But again, things being intertwined. And then this last piece I was fascinated to find. This is a contract with Laura and a group called the Sisters of Diana, where she was contracted to become the mechanic and maintenance person for a school bus that they were calling the Magic Ferry. And this is a lesbian collective in Oklahoma that had purchased a bus and was going to use it to sort of move people around the Midwest to go to particularly women's festivals, organizing events, and it was gonna be supported by selling like membership tickets for people to this. It operated for at least a year as far as I can tell, but it offers another look at how intertwined this history is, not just St. Louis, but also looking out into the wider Midwest. All right, and then one of the most amazing parts of the collection are the photographs that Laura saved. So I picked out just a couple to show you, and to start with is this photograph, which is showing the aftermath of a women's bar in St. Louis called Les or More. And Les or More was destroyed by arson. There's a whole story behind that, which I'll get to more a bit later in the presentation. As far as I know, this is the only original photograph that is in an archive currently that shows this bar after its fire. And if you kind of squint at the screen, you can see in the middle is a black spray paint that says "We are everywhere," and then those are women icons underneath. And then there's racist and sexist graffiti that have been added by the neighborhood. And this is part of a larger story about issues of hate and violence and reactions. But I was absolutely floored when I saw this photograph, because I had only ever seen images of this printed and published in newspapers, not an original photograph. I picked out one of the photos of Laura. This is when she's a bit younger. It is not identified on the photograph, but based on the context, she is at a women's festival. It's either the Michigan Women's Festival or the Midwest Women's Festival. She attended both, and I'm not entirely clear from the photographs which this is, although I'm hoping in the future I'll be able to talk to someone who can better identify what is in the pictures. But she is helping operate the music and the DJ and the PA system here. And then there are also photographs of marches and activist movements, some of which are identified. This is one that I find particularly striking that is unfortunately not identified, although I do hope that once I'm able to show it to more people, someone will be able to reach out and let me know where and roughly when this event occurred. It clearly looks like it was in the 1980s, but beyond that, I haven't been able to find any identification to pick out a building to know what city it was in. All right. So as I said, her collection is pretty large. It does also include correspondence, letters, personal notes back and forth. Here's a note card from someone who's offering some cooperative labor as part of their gift. Here's a note card that's an invitation to a party. And I point this one out because even a lot can be learned from the envelopes that are included. So this one particularly struck me. It's something, you know, that I've thought about as we think about the concept of talking about marriage, same-sex marriage, heteronormative marriage, you know, the issue of last names. Laura and Marlene were together for decades, and they have a lot of male, and, you know, it's just addressed to Laura and Marlene, because obviously they had different last names, and that takes up a lot of real estate on a little bitty envelope. So throughout the collection, there's just little things that offer, you know, really important glimpses into history. Another large portion of the collection are articles and publications written by Laura, some also written by Marlene, and some that they wrote together. And it's not just the publication. It also includes drafts, earlier versions that were proposed to publications, corrections, and you can really kind of get some of the spirit of Laura's very much attention to detail and unwillingness to let even the smallest error in information go. So here is a letter she wrote to the editor of the St. Louis American newspaper in response to an article that they published about her nomination to the Civil Rights Commission. And Laura becomes the first openly gay or lesbian member of the Civil Rights Enforcement Committee in the city of St. Louis, which was a very important first. She struggled on the Civil Rights Enforcement Agency, but it was still a very groundbreaking thing. She struggled because they were very bureaucratic and they didn't actually do much, and Laura was interested in getting things done. But here she wrote to correct the spelling of Rudy Nicken's name. She wrote to correct the name of the political organization they mentioned, and then also to make sure that other people involved were credited. I don't believe this was ever published, but it's a good representation of what's found throughout the collection. All right. So as I said, working on finishing up, organizing and listing all the information in Laura and Morris papers, and that will get added to the website, I'm hoping by the end of the year, and be available if people have questions. So I'm going to kind of shift gears here and talk about exploring the archives by looking beneath the surface of existing archival collections and thinking about how are things described, how are things cataloged, and making sure that the LGBTQ history is findable and usable, and that people who are looking for it are aware of what's in the archives. And you know, this is an ongoing process because as things were collected, they weren't necessarily noted that way at the time that they were collected. So this is an ongoing process for me. So what I'd like to show you is just a few of the things that we've kind of surfaced in the last year or so, and show those to you now. So the first, this is a really recent discovery from the University Archives, and some of you may recognize who this is, but I was delighted to find that in 1974, Christine Jorgensen visited and spoke on the campus of Washington University. And this is a photograph. She's meeting with someone in their office. I'm not sure who she's meeting with, but this was taken while she was visiting campus in February 1974. And if you perhaps have heard the name, but can't quite place why you know that name, Christine Jorgensen, she is one of the earliest outspoken trans proponents. She was able to have gender surgery in the 1950s in Denmark, and then after that spent a long time touring the United States and I believe Canada, speaking out for trans rights, for to help people understand the rights that trans people deserve. So I was delighted to find that she had spoken on campus, and actually, interestingly, had spoken during a sexual symposium week that the student organization had sponsored. And other people that included, that spoke that week were Dr. Benjamin Spock, the publisher of Penthouse, and also Dr. Joyce Brothers, the TV personality. So it must have been quite the experience to hear all these individuals speak. A number of items were things that were noted as part of gay lib or homosexual rights in the ACLU of Missouri's papers. But in researching the ACLU of Missouri's history this past few years, and particularly this past year as the library sponsored an exhibition in honor of the ACLU of Missouri's 100th anniversary, I learned a great deal more about just what some of the things in the collection were, and some of them are real one-of-a-kind items. They include letters, oh, let me go back here. They include letters such as this from the Mandrake Society of St. Louis, which was the earliest advocacy group organized in St. Louis in 1969. And here they're writing to the American Civil Liberties Union in St. Louis and asking for someone to come speak, and also for some handouts of people to know their rights about being arrested, which Joyce Armstrong, then director of the ACLU of Eastern Missouri, did go speak to the group, as far as I understand, although there's not a record of what that consisted of. But there's also some other things I found in the correspondence of the ACLU. This one I found particularly fascinating. So this is this is part of a series of correspondence from 1972 from someone named David Hesbett. At the time, David is incarcerated in Springfield, Missouri, although he's also at other points incarcerated in St. Louis and then in Texas. And he is writing to the ACLU to talk about discrimination that he sees happening, and to tell them that he has started a group called the Groovy Gay Guys that he has organized as a liberation group in prison. And while the ACLU of Eastern Missouri can't do a lot to help him, they do send him information. He asks for the names of local gay liberation groups, and the ACLU puts him in touch with those St. Louis gay liberation groups. As you know, so they do the best they can, but this to me is fascinating because as far as I know, this doesn't exist anywhere else in an archive. It's the only copy. Another thing that is in the ACLU papers, which is, I think, a story just really begging for someone to dig into more, maybe that's me, maybe that's someone else, is the marriage of Judy and Denise Macon. And Judy and Denise Macon, in 1975, they lived in Waynesville, Missouri, which is out in western Missouri. They wanted to get married. So they got a blood test from the doctor, and they went to the license office, and they got a marriage license. And at the time in Missouri law, there was nothing in the way the marriage license was written that indicated anything about man and woman. It just said, you know, this person takes this person to be bound in holy matrimony. And so they got their marriage license, and there wasn't an issue. There was an issue when they went to the judge at the courthouse to have the ceremony finalized, and the judge refused to do it. So they drove to St. Louis, and they went to the Metropolitan Community Church, the MCC, which at that time was only about 3 years old. And Reverend Carol Curitin, who was the founding pastor of that church, as I said, only had been in St. Louis for a few years, performed the ceremony, signed the certificate. They filed it at the county courthouse. It was filed. Everything was good. The reason this is in the American Civil Liberties Union file is because Helen went to go change her name on her driver's license, and the Department of Revenue refused to acknowledge their marriage certificate, saying that they couldn't do that. And so they had written to the ACLU asking for help. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like they ever got back to the ACLU. The notes indicate that they said, we need to get some more information and, follow up. They were going to jointly file their taxes, and they were going to let the ACLU know how that went. But then the file cuts off there. So I am fascinated to find out more about this. But that is for now an interesting story, but a bit of a mystery how that continued. All right. Now, another story that comes out of the ACLU of Missouri papers is the story of Goldstein Johnson. Now, this is a story that we had tracked down a few years ago for the Mapping LGBTQ St. Louis project, but I have over the past couple of years learned more about Goldstein Johnson. There are more files in the ACLU papers filed under other topics that give more description of how Johnson was arrested for cross-dressing. In the early 1970s, he's arrested multiple times. It's a sad tale. I had found his obituary. He was in the middle of working with the ACLU to challenge the cross-dressing ordinance. And I say we don't actually know much about Goldstein Johnson. This is far before the era of people being able to really express their pronouns or how they want to present. But Johnson was convicted several times and spent time in the city workhouse for cross-dressing. And the case was being challenged in the Missouri Supreme Court when Johnson was shot and killed, sadly, in 1974. And it's really just such a sad tale. And I've only ever been able to find sad information and don't have a photograph of Goldstein Johnson. So this summer, I actually, I commissioned a portrait from a local artist. I have no idea if this is what Goldstein Johnson looked like, but after I gave the information to Ori Tala, who's a queer artist, they do local art, and portraiture was something that they said they specialized in. So I gave them the description of what we knew, and this is their imagined vision of Goldstein Johnson. So at least that we would have a face and a bit of flair to go with the story. All right, so I'm gonna move on. So as I mentioned, we had found Goldstein Johnson's story as part of the Mapping LGBTQ St. Louis project. And I'm sure some of you on this call have seen the maps online. If you tried looking at them yesterday or earlier today, we were having some technical issues, so you probably got an error message. But just to give you a little background, so this was a grant-funded project that started in roughly 2015 and published online in 2017. The grant covered research and website development, and initially there was a large group of undergraduates and some graduate students, along with myself and Andrea Friedman in Women, Gender, Sexuality Studies in the Department of History. So the initial site went up in October of 2017. We received some additional grant funding in 2019 and began working on expansion of the map, some technical updates, and we had hoped to do some community programming. But those plans for early 2020 were foiled. So we we have done our best to keep up with it, although we've certainly had to dramatically shift what we had initially planned. And so the goal for the rest of 2020 was to finish data cleanup and to get new content and a new interface online. And that is what is in the works and what I'm going to show you today. And this is some of the new content that you can see, this little screenshot here, some of the new content that we're adding to the site. But I'm gonna go into the websites themselves and show you those. So this is the current website, and this is how you can get to the current website, and we can share this in chat later as well. This is what the current website looks like, and I'm gonna show you quickly, and then this is the start of the new platforms website. I'm gonna switch my screen here. And you don't need to see my email. So this is the current site, and it has some longer essays that are thematic. And these are all still part of the new site, but we got feedback from a number of folks that these essays, while interesting, were very long. And so what we have done is work on making some new content that is a little bit shorter. And we're putting this into the new platform, which is a little more user-friendly. It's also web-enabled for mobile, which the old site is not. But this is not quite ready to debut yet. But what this has is a place to explore a map that's not there, but also some short guided tours. Some short tours like connecting the dots and looking at how do these dots of history, all of these places being a point of LGBTQ history in St. Louis, how do they connect? How can maps help us understand these? What does this mean about St. Louis as a place? There's also the story of the More or Less bar, the story of the bar and the fire behind it. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to add that new photograph in there. We look at Forest Park, which has a lot of events happening in it that have to do with LGBTQ history. Everything from casual get-togethers to pride marches to conflicts with crime and policing. We look at Miss Fanny's Ball, which is appropriate for the season as it was the annual Halloween ball. And then also a short essay that looks at two African-American predominantly bars in St. Louis, Bill's Bar, which was mostly African-American women, and the Zebra Lounge, which was one of the only bars in St. Louis that actively worked to try to include across racial lines. And then we're also slowly working on converting the existing maps from their current interface, which is not friendly for tablets and phones, into the new interface. And the best example I can give you of that is the one that's done, which is the political actions and organizing timeline. And this is what the new timeline looks like. And it goes kind of by decade and gives you little bits of history starting in the 1940s and going through the 1990s that you can scroll through and read about. And you can also jump around and jump to the part you want. And just to kind of show you the difference, this is that same information but presented on the existing page, which is just a tad overwhelming and doesn't load necessarily really well. So I am glad that we're able to get to a new interface. All right, let me switch over, and I think can make the slide sharing work. All right, let me do this. So we have new pages coming. We will announce the updates on our Twitter page. And you also, I want to give you my email, but we have time for questions now. We have about 20 minutes for questions. So if you have something you'd like to ask, just put in the chat. And if you'd like to talk and unmute yourself, that would be great. But you also can just type your question into the chat. So I'll open it up to everyone, and I'm also going to stop recording.